Hey guys, I'm excited today. I have Ryan Rominger. He's a friend of my teacher, Elizabeth Sabet, who I had on the podcast a while back. Um, I was looking for someone to talk about near-death experiences, and Elizabeth recommended him to me. And so we got to talking and thought that we would have two episodes, and we'll have one on near-death experiences later. But this one's going to focus more on Ryan's story and awakening experience or spiritual emergency, many different names. So Ryan, you want to introduce yourself a little bit more?
Sure, yeah. My name's Ryan, as you just mentioned. I am an experiencer from both childhood as well as in adulthood. I had kind of a big experience in my 20s, early 20s, while I was going to grad school. So professionally, I am a psychologist and a counselor, a therapist. And so my first two degrees are in transpersonal psychology, my master's and PhD, and my second master's is in clinical mental health counseling. So I can go into more history if you want than that,
Yeah. So you worked at ASSIST with Elizabeth. What is that?
ASSIST, the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences, is what ASSIST stands for. And it's an organization that is focused on teaching professionals, so therapists, spiritual directors, coaches, and now also peer leaders, how to work with an individual who's had a spiritual experience that they're trying to integrate, they're trying to cope with in some way. And it was really evolved out of some early meetings at an organization called IANS, which is an organization focused on near-death experiences, International Association of Near-Death Studies. And they, at their conferences, very much focused on the academic side. And Lane Stout, the founder of ASSIST, and some others started having meetings and said, you know what, we really want to focus on professionals and training the professionals how to deal with these types of experiences. Because that's really the first line. It's the place where those who've had experiences are really going to come into contact. Is those, and so we were training MDs, we were training therapists, all across the board. So it was actually quite fun, an enjoyable group.
Yeah, that's great. Obviously, that's near and dear to my heart since I had my own experience and went to the psych ward. And it would be nice to have known or had the help of ASSIST in that respect. So I think what y'all do is really great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about your story and let's get into it?
Sure. My story really starts with my first memories, oddly enough. Some of my very earliest memories are of kind of being in this otherworldly place and playing with other children, jumping across the corner of a pond and Romanesque type architecture, Greco-Roman architecture. And I never understood it. I wasn't aware of why this existed. It predated some of my earliest dream memories. And I found out, early teens, that I had actually had what could be now classified as a near-death experience. When I was an infant, I fell off of a raft into the water off the coast of Texas. And it took him a little bit to kind of fish through the surf and get me up onto the raft. I suspect possibly that I had something like a near-death experience at that time. That's my closest guess. But it also kind of resulted in, I believe, experiences throughout childhood which were kind of different. Some type of meditative experiences that I had. When I was a sophomore into my junior year in high school, I had an experience of a light being that at the time I was just starting a dating relationship with a Christian girl. And the experience itself was I went to sleep that night, so like every other night. And I became aware that I was sitting up in bed having this conversation with for what, for lack of a better explanation, was a being of light on the other side of my room. And the conversation closed, and the being, whatever it was, folded in on itself and disappeared. And it had a very angelic presence. I remember the feeling of just undescribable love permeating everything. Something that you might think of kind of being in the classic light near-death experience, light-based near-death experience. And but anyway, so I became aware that that's where I was at, the light being disappeared. And so I was sitting there with this unexplainable experience. And because of the context of dating this girl at the time, I classified it as, I just had some sort of either angelic or Jesus experience, and so in the evangelical church we were going to, that's how I talked about it. Looking back, it felt more angelic, I would say, than kind of a meeting with Jesus. I didn't get any visual like some people describe of a Jesus experience, and I do remember kind of from the light, some emanations outward that could be described as wings, light diffusion, something. I don't know. It was wonderful.
Yeah. So first, going back to your near-death experience when you're young, you were saying some of your earliest memories are playing with children in this kind of like Greco-Roman landscape. Would you say, is that part of your near-death experience, or kind of how would you describe that?
So I think of it as that near-death experience.
Okay.
That was the part of me that was in the other world, the other side, during the near-death experience, playing with the other children. And again, the feeling tone of that place was infused with love. It was very light, joyful, just kind of permeated everything. Could it have been what some people describe as between life experiences? Sure. I don't know. I can't prove it one way or the other. I just know that was the earliest experience, earliest memory that I grew up with.
That's interesting. And you think that opened you up kind of to the spiritual world, and so you had more experiences with like spirits or the spirit world?
Yeah, it seemed like it acted as a catalyst in some way, or predisposed me in some way to have experiences and kind of be oriented towards thinking about spirituality on some level. I was always an avid reader and reading things like Buddhist texts and weird things as a kid. So, my brother, I had an older brother, or still do, 6 years older than me, and he would bring home these other books on different religions, and I would eat them up, and I was always kind of fascinated. And I'm sure that shaped things as well. But, even encounter ghost types of experiences and those types of things, I just seemed to have
just normal to you.
Yeah, it was. It was very normal. It was just like, oh yeah, there's so-and-so. And I had a grandfather pass when I was about 12 years old. And ever since then, I've had, every now and then I smell cigarette smoke and beer, which is one of his classic, what he smelled like when I was alive, and so for me, it's like, oh, hey, Grandpa, you're here again. It's kind of the warp and weave of everyday life. It seems like it's just like, okay, wow. Yeah, there's that.
So was your family, were they religious or spiritual growing up, and how did that impact your views or how you thought about your experiences?
So my mother's side of the family was Lutheran and my father's was Methodist. And so I grew up going to the Methodist church primarily as a kid. But we were the Easter and Christmas family. We'd show up occasionally throughout the year, but primarily for large holidays. And my again, I was probably my junior year in high school. I became involved with evangelical church for 3 to 4 years into the beginning of my college undergraduate. And, so I had that influence my later adolescence, and which again shaped me into going into college. And then I went to a Jesuit university, Gonzaga, and I had Catholic influence because I minored in religion there and majored in psychology. So even from that age, I was still kind of oriented towards, hey, let's figure this out, either psychologically or spiritually, religiously. And
Right. Did you talk to your family or others about your experiences growing up, and how did they respond to that, if so?
Yeah, there's actually a story that my mother likes to tell, that when I was 5 years old, they were talking about, prior life stuff and just kind of young adults talking about stuff. And I walked up to him and said, "Oh yeah, in my past life, I was a fisherman." And then just walked off.
Wow.
And they're like, "What?" And so yeah, I've talked to them about these types of things. I firmly believe the house that I grew up in, which was built in between 1911 and 1913, it's an old farmstead house here in Montana. We're fifth generation farmers here in Montana. I firmly believe that has some spirits in it. Both my brother and I had very similar experiences of encounters with something in that house, which we did not find out until I was about 35, and we were having lunch with my mother, and he described his experience, and I was like, oh my gosh, I had the same type of experience when I was a kid. And that was an encounter with a kind of a shadow person that would come and sit on the edge of our bed, and we could actually feel the depression, and it felt very menacing at the time. I had no clue growing up that he had that experience, but it was a bit of a shock to all of us when we both described the same exact thing.
Wow.
But yeah, we used to talk about it. I mean, I think that my family was open to that anyway. My dad, for a period, was a drummer in a couple of different bands, but one of the band names was Siddhartha, which is, Buddha. The name of Buddha. So I think their orientation even was Eastern in many ways, even with the Methodist and Lutheran background.
Yeah. So. That's so nice. It's so unique.
Yeah, kind of, and yeah, it's kind of odd. Yeah.
Yeah. So with your experience with the light beings, did they say anything to you? Do you feel like they had a purpose or had a message for you, or just, hey, we're here?
Well, it was one being, and yes, as I became aware that I was finishing this conversation, there was a definite message in that. There was a definite specific communication, which I almost immediately forgot. It's like I couldn't hold it. But there was something there. I couldn't tell you what it was.
Wow. So do you think that was a message that was maybe meant for your like unconscious, and like that was the way it was supposed to be, or just that you were unable to hold that container, that message, or maybe the message is like too big for your logical mind at the time? Or
I think all of the above could be possible. I think that with the emotional tone that was being kind of conveyed as well, I think the message was not just linguistic and verbal. It was probably multidimensional, so to speak. It was hitting me on different levels. And quite possibly was bigger than my consciousness could hold, particularly because I wasn't waking up. I was becoming aware that I was already awake in a conversation. So it's like my consciousness was shrinking back down into my body that could contain my normal waking consciousness. I was definitely in an altered state.
Right. It's kind of like, I'm sure a lot of people have had dream experiences. I'll wake up and I have a feeling that I've had a dream, and I have certain feelings about it, and then I'll try to think of what the dream was, and I'll have like little glimpses and pieces of it, but not the whole thing. And it's just like slipping out of my grasp, but it's
Mm-hmm.
more the sense and that feeling that is stronger, that I can feel that I had this dream, but I can't really remember. It's just what's left of it. And
Yep.
again, what you said, your consciousness maybe wasn't ready for it. It was too big. I've done meditations where made me very sleepy, or I even fell asleep and felt a lot of energy. And then over time, doing that same meditation, I was able to feel less and less sleepy and feel like I could uh, contain the container. I was able to hold that and experience it while fully awake and feel very energetic. So I
Mm-hmm.
think there's something to that. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and Charlie Tart talks about that in his books on altered states of consciousness, about how we can gain meaning in different altered states that is difficult to integrate into our waking conscious state. And because of that, doing work with that integration process becomes important. How do we
Mm,
pull that, what we've learned or gained, the knowledge we've gained? And sometimes it's not just, again, linguistic knowledge. It might be a somatic body sense knowledge. It might be
mm,
emotional. It might be higher self. I mean, there's so many different layers of knowledge that it could be coming through.
yeah. Wow. And so you had more experiences as well later on.
Yeah, and so I progressed through undergraduate at Gonzaga, decided with my major in psychology and my minor in religion to pursue, I was going to become a therapist that was spiritually oriented. So I found a school that at the time would kind of hold that container for that, and it was the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto, California. It is no longer called that. It is called Sophia University, and I don't know what their container for that type of work is at this point. It's been some years since I've been back there. I know they were purchased, and there was some changes to different programs, but anyway, that's where I decided to go, and started grad school with the intention of being a therapist, and quickly realized that I, at that time, wanted to do spiritual direction and expressive arts, combine those two rather
Mm,
than the clinical therapeutic piece. And that decision really was as I was tuning into who was I as a 22-year-old, 21, 22-year-old coming fresh out of undergrad. Could I hold my own emotional health and well-being while going through the program in that way? And I just decided that I was being called to the spiritual direction component. So
mm,
I engaged fully in that. And then in my second year of that program, I had an experience in January 24th of that second year that really just shook me to my core. I classify it as a Kundalini experience. But oddly enough, we were in the spiritual direction program. We were doing a lot of different spiritual practices. So we were doing yoga in the one class for that quarter. It was a Sufism class, so we were reading a lot of Sufi poetry, like Rumi, Colin Barthes Rumi,
mm.
engaging
Love
in
Rumi.
Sufi practices. My advisor was actually the Sufi sheikh, Rajit Frazier, Bob Frazier in California, is head of that division of Sufism, or that area, I should say. So he was teaching us about Sufism, and I was practicing a Sufi practice called the 99 Names, where you repeat one of the names of Allah or God, and you meditate on that name and what it means, because each of the 99 names has a specific meaning.
Mm,
And that day I was actually focused on Al-Mumin, the death, and what is it? What is death? What is your thoughts and feelings around death, and you do the meditation several times throughout the day, which is repeating it 99 times. And that evening, I was engaged in, I was a research assistant, so I was helping out another faculty member going over her research in Menlo Park. And we were at a restaurant, and I just was having these, I would see colors, and colors seemed more vibrant, and my body was kind of tingling. I was starting to feel altered, like something was, that was almost like a dreamlike quality as I was doing this research. And then something hit my intestines. It was almost like I'd had bad food, and everything just started going through me. And I was like, hey guys, there's one other person there. I gotta go. We need to, I can't be here anymore. There's something going on with my system. Maybe I had the flu, maybe something. I didn't know what was going on. And from walking to the restaurant to the parking lot, which was in back, my body had started shaking. And by the time we got to where the car was, I was shaking so bad I could barely walk. So they sat me down.
Shaking while standing up. That's wild.
Yeah, I had these rhythmic shaking from my center, from my waist, down through my legs and up through my torso, throughout my arms. And I was aware, I was conscious of where I was at that time. And so they sat me down and they were talking to me. The person I was with, the faculty member I was with, also happened to be a Sufi practitioner. And she was like, why don't you say some of your, the Sufi practices that you're doing? Because she knew I was doing those as well. And I skipped right from her recommendation to saying the phrase, there is no God but God. In the Sufi, I'm saying it wrong now. It's been so many years. I hate it. But anyway, the phrase is, there is no God but God. And it's like time stopped. The shaking, everything just stopped. And I felt like I was connected to everything within a couple mile radius. Like I could feel people, I could feel cars, I could feel the structure of the landscape around me. It's like my boundary of self disappeared, and I was connected to everything around me, and I was just weeping, I was just crying. I was, and laughing at the same time. And she noticed, and she's like, whoa, you are really out there. You're really having a big experience. Maybe out there is not the right word. You're having a big experience. And she noticed, also being a therapist, I was not in a condition to drive. I just was not grounded. There's no way I could do. So they got me into their car, and she had a key to another therapist from the school, his office. And so she took me to his office in the area, and we spent about 3 hours of me processing. And my body was shaking. I could not have told you where I was or where that office was. As soon as we got into the car and we started moving, I lost all sense of space. I lost all sense of time. I couldn't tell you. And then while we were processing, the old grief of grieving my grandfather came up, and I talked through that and processed that. And then there were these other memories that came up. And so she was holding space for me as the stuff was just getting burned through as this continued. And after about 3 hours, she's like, you about done yet? and at that point, I'd gone through enough to where it closed. And they ended up driving me back. We were in San Francisco Bay Area, so they drove me up to Burlingame, where I was living with my wife at the time. And they dropped me off and said, yeah, he couldn't drive. We had to bring him home. Sorry.
No you alcohol. Say it closed. What did you mean by that?
So when she said that, it was as if it triggered something going, okay, we're done for now. And the shaking stopped, the processing stopped, and I was brought back to, again, that sense of person, place, and time. I was able to be there in that moment. And I still was not great with space. I was still kind of dizzy and not fully grounded and centered. I think they made the right choice for driving me, because I would not have been a safe driver at all. And I actually couldn't drive for a couple of months after that experience. The California traffic was too much. It was too fast. It was too overstimulating. There's a lot of changes. We'll get into the changes, but I had a lot of changes after that experience.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That gives me chills. I had my own experience, and so much of that resonates. I think my awakening was also Kundalini Awakening. I had those shakes and felt that energy, and I felt so connected to everyone. And I don't know if I lost so much sense of time and space as you. I will say, I think at one point after my experience, I kind of lost. I was losing more sense of time and space. I was not eating and sleeping as much. I felt really energetic and not hungry, and I was kind of like leaving my stuff around campus, and they're like, "I'll find it later." And yeah, that's really interesting. And so on my energy retreat that I went to a while back, again, feel a lot of energy. Not to the level of like the awakening, but in that I think that energy goes through your body and it helps you connect with emotions that may be stuck, and helps you get that out, and also feel in this place of safety and feel good enough in your body to actually process that and work through that. And so other people that were in that retreat, we would talk a lot about stuff you're going through in life. And so I think there's something to that energy, and then processing through emotions and experiences in the past, like you did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's why it's important for people that have had these types of experiences to have a therapist who knows what they're talking about, who's open to these types of things. Whether it's a transpersonal therapist or a humanistic, spiritually oriented therapist, but somebody who's open to holding space for it is not going to bring their own judgment or classification to the experience, but really kind of hold space for you to, or me or whoever, to process whatever they're going through, the psychological component as well as the psychospiritual component. I also had a therapist afterwards that was able to hold space and let me continue processing some of that grief that I had from my grandfather and some of the other stuff that was coming through.
Yeah.
I think that's important.
Yeah, that's great. And one thing that's coming up in my mind is, in psychology, we talk about and spirituality, how you need to feel your feelings but not be them. So it's kind of from a secondhand perspective, and I think that experiences like that help us connect with a deeper part of ourselves. You could say like our spirit, which we would say is connected to the all, and in that experience is that opportunity to take one step back and deal with trauma that maybe before our body wasn't ready to process, because we would just be lost in it and see ourselves as solely that. And so now in that experience, we can see a bigger sense of ourselves and not get lost in that trauma, and work through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And,
I mean, you mentioned trauma, and I think that's a piece that sometimes isn't talked about for STEers, spiritually transformative experiencers, the trauma of the experience. So not only the trauma of prior to whatever we had going on in life, for me, part of that was my grandfather's death, but the trauma of the experience itself. So I walked away with a lot of trauma feelings around that experience. And I would get triggered into flashbacks. I would get triggered into kind of somatic sensations, anxiety and panic, when specific memories or feelings of being out of control in that way would come up. And I had a lot of work to do to resolve some of the kind of almost a PTSD type response from the Kundalini Awakening experience. And I think that's important to know too for a lot of people, that, yeah, you might need to do some work around that.
Yeah. I mean, definitely for me, I went to the psych ward, and I didn't know what that experience was. And, I felt during that experience, I felt somewhat so connected and so loving, and then kind of felt the opposite after going to the psych ward and being put on meds and stuff like that. And it was really hard. I almost think of it kind of like a little bit as an addiction. I want that feeling back, want that experience back. And it's like, I don't know if withdrawals or something, but I do think, like you said, in that experience, it kind of breaks our sense of self and our ego, you'd say.
Yeah.
And, we're not, after that experience, you're not in that same level of connection. And so I guess you kind of lose a little bit of that greater sense of yourself. And so, but you've also broken who you were before. So it's kind of like unmooring. It's kind of like you lost your rock of who you are. And so, like you said, it probably takes work to figure that out again, and kind of regain a little bit of sense of that greater self, but while still trying to operate in the everyday life, and not be so high in that as much as that experience before. So it's just, I guess, that middle ground.
I use the word shattered. I felt shattered. My sense of who I was, my belief about kind of reality, and how much this fuzzy spiritual practice we were doing could affect physical reality. And realizing that some of these practices can have a profound real world impact on our physical self. It shattered my concept of both the practices, but who I was in the world. And I had to reconstitute that. I had to relearn who I was in the world and how I could function. And part of that for me was some of these changes I was talking about. I had a huge shift in eating patterns. It was like night and day. From one day to the next, I was craving high amounts of protein. I was drinking tons of orange juice, eating lots of bananas. Those were some of the ones I really remember. And I remember you saying that you almost had the opposite. You didn't want to eat.
Right. I did eat a lot healthier when I did eat, but yeah, I ate a lot less.
Yeah. So my metabolism completely shifted overnight. And then I actually was eating probably 5 meals a day. I was snacking on bars in between meals. I mean, I was constantly just taking in food. My sleep shifted and changed. I had kind of a manic phase for the first week afterwards. I was not getting a whole lot of sleep, and journaling a lot, trying to, again, process a lot of the emotions and the thoughts and my fear about what was happening. And I think I wrote, 100 pages in my journal in a matter of days, front and back. I had the advantage, though, of being in a school of psychologists and therapists who were also practitioners. I had one person who was both an MD and a PhD that was also a specialist in Kundalini. Her name was Dr. Olga Luchikova. She actually came to my apartment and assessed me because I continued to have kriyas, the body shaking, for a couple of weeks afterwards. But in that week immediately afterwards, she came because I took a week and a half off of grad school. I just couldn't function enough. So she came and she assessed me and said, "Oh yeah, here's what's happening. It's third chakra and head chakra," and she went off on what was going on. And I ended up working with her for a number of years after that because of that. And anyway, the advantage of having those people who knew what was going on, who could differentiate and say, this is not psychosis. It's not a psychotic break. You were fully conscious. It wasn't a seizure because you were fully conscious during it. Yes, you were in an altered state, but it was not kind of a schizophrenic altered state.
Mm-hmm.
There weren't hallucinations. There weren't something like that. So they did all the assessment and they're like, yeah, that's not that. This is more like a spiritual awakening Kundalini experience. And having that context and be able to ride through this in that context, I think I was very, very lucky. I don't think there's a lot of people who don't get that. Had I not been in that context, I think I also would have gone to, a psych ward until things stabilized and been medicated. And that's one thing about assist in training therapists and spiritual directors, being able to notice and really pick up on these signs and say, let's differentiate psychosis from spiritual awakening. This is what's going on. And sometimes people do need to be grounded before they can re-enter and function. And sometimes that grounding does include medication, and that's okay. That's okay. You do what you need to do in order to move forward.
Yeah. So how did your wife and your family take your experience?
My wife was really shook up. We didn't have kids yet. And I don't know if you want to call it synchronicity, but the week that my experience happened was the same week we conceived with my oldest child, our first child. He would have been implanting, or she would have been implanting in her uterus at that time. So maybe TMI there, but point being, the fact that it was the very same week and she didn't find out that she was pregnant until a month and a half to 2 months later, reflecting back, we go, oh, that's when that happened. It was a kind of an interesting experience.
Yeah.
But no, she was very shook up. She was in contact with her parents, and there was a bit of a, oh my God, what did I marry into? Because we'd gotten married a year and a half before that. So it was a new marriage. We're still married today,
Right.
25 years later, but it was harrowing for her to watch me go through that and try and figure out how to support. There was also the fear that, she was the financial support. I was in grad school, and now this weird thing with this husband is happening. And it's like, oh my gosh, do I need the support? How am I going to do this? And now I'm pregnant to top it off. So we had stuff to work through, but I think that was a piece of it that was grounding for me too, was, coming back to, there were real world things I needed to focus on. Part of that was getting ready for the baby. And so after the first several months, that helped me ground. For several months, I was still pretty ungrounded. I was back in school probably 2 to 3 weeks later. And I think I also mentioned to you, I had a kind of a ripple experience 1 month afterwards. My father-in-law took me to a baseball game up in San Francisco. And during the baseball game, I had a reemergence of the shaking and had electricity, felt like it went through from the base of my spine, kind of up through my spine, then through my right shoulder and through my right eye. And I woke up the next morning after that, able to see 20/20 vision without my glasses, but with light sensitivity, and have had photosensitivity, photoesthesia ever since. So, but after about a week and a half, that my eyes returned back to normal, and I started wearing my glasses again. But I had to wear sunglasses. It was just, everything was too bright.
Wow. And I know in my awakening experience, I told you, at one point I looked at the sun in mid-afternoon, and it didn't bother me, and all the clouds around it kind of just disappeared. And for a while afterwards, I would kind of look at places where the sun would be like shining off of cars or different stuff like that, and I'll kind of like dilate my eyes and really focus on it, and I felt like it was giving me more energy or something, or it was like fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Light and energy has been an interesting relationship ever since then. I burn out watches. I have burned out watches ever since then, all the time. It's hard for me to, well, for probably about 20 years, I couldn't wear watches because
Wow.
people would buy me a watch, as a present, and I'd wear it for a month or two, and it would burn out, and I'd take it in to get fixed. And they're like, "We don't know what's wrong. We can't fix it. It's not the battery.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, your battery's dead, but it's not just the battery."
Wow. Yeah, I know, from reading near-death experiences that a lot of people have issues with technology and it goes wonky, or some people even have to like move out in the country and be away from technology. It really messes with them.
Yeah. Yep. Light bulbs going out, computer problems, all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have a lot of problems with external tech, like environmental tech or computers. Fortunately, I mean, I was in grad school. That would have been really bad. I wouldn't have wanted to write, my dissertation by hand. That would have been horrible. Yeah.
Yeah. So, um, did did you feel afterwards, obviously, kind of like a different person, and was that hard to reconcile, like with your wife and other people who knew you?
Yes and no. Um, I think there were shifting and there were differences, but I was still the same person.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was more of an expanded self. Fortunately, she was also spiritual in nature and willing to grow and go with the flow. We did a lot of yoga together.
Mm-hmm.
We were in yoga classes my second year together, and so I think that helped. Not only because we had stuff that we did together, but it gave a framework, and giving Kundalini yoga as the framework.
Mm-hmm.
And she could also talk to the yoga teachers and get some of that framework as well. She was raised Catholic, but wasn't a devout or conservative Catholic. It's more liberal and more spiritual in nature. But so I think I lucked out there that she was willing to flow with that. I don't think I had such a large personality shift that it was real difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's not the case for everyone. Some
Mm-hmm.
people have really large shifts, and it hurts their marriages. We were also in a new marriage, so we were still figuring each other out.
Right.
So
It wasn't so well established that.
yeah, if it had been a 20-year marriage already, and we had our established roles and kind of personality traits and established ongoing arguments, as couples tend to get, then I think that would have been a different. So when I did my dissertation, as was on near-death experiences, and when I did a lot of the background research for that, there's a lot of research that shows anecdotal and some research that shows the way that couples break up, especially when one partner changes and it's a divergent change and they really are going on different paths, then that separates people if the other one's not willing to go with the flow.
Right. Yeah. I think for me, and it's hard to know, was it me not eating and sleeping? Was it the meds? Was it the experience itself? Although I wouldn't say it's the experience itself, but my brain was really slowed down, and I was thinking very simple after the experience. But I say I don't think it was the experience itself because I went a month afterwards. But it's hard to know. But I kind of had to obviously recuperate and I guess regain more of my brain capabilities. But I definitely think that ever since then, I think growing up, my brain was always going very fast, and there was a lot of anxiety and overthinking and stuff like that. And I kind of felt like a different person. And even thinking about my life before my experience, it kind of all felt hazy, like it was a different life almost.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that over time, they that me before that experience became more clear and yeah, more integrated. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's just interesting to consider all that.
Yeah, it was definitely for me a defining moment. Uh, Developmentally, we're it's going through development and progression and growing from childhood all the way till our late years.
Mm-hmm.
That's not just childhood development, but we're developing in our teens, we're developing in our 20s, and so there's some normal developmental processes that are happening during that time, as we become independent and partner up and whatnot. So I think it's normal for there to be some development, but for myself, looking back on that, so I can see where I was going through some of those normal developmental changes, but this is kind of that piece that was a defining shift in, both in my pursuit of religious and spiritual practices. Before this, I was on the track to be, and I did get certified as a spiritual director, spiritual guidance certification, but my personal practice, I really pulled back from. So in the years leading up to it, I was hitting the meditations really hard. I was hitting every practice they would throw at us and say, here, try this. We did Theravada Buddhism for a while. We did, the Sufism. We did different things. And I hit every one with, everything I had. After this experience, I was much more tentative.
Mm.
And I would enter into whatever practice they were teaching us at the time. But I was also very conscious and aware of what was going on inside of me. Mm-hmm. How is it activating these energies? How is it triggering some of the PTSD pieces? I think that's another defining piece is after this, I had struggles with that triggering and the panic that would come up. I also, because of that experience of the lightning going through my right eye, ended up with a lot of vertigo. So when I would get in high spaces, and I developed a fear of heights, so I would get in high spaces and I would start to have panic. And that's something that even in the past 5 years, I've really had to work with.
Wow.
And successfully so. But so that means for over 20, 25 years, I've had fear of heights, and a piece of that stems from that one experience of that lightning going through my right eye and this vertigo and this sense of space as another piece of it. I would enter into an airport or a high-rise building, and it's like I could feel the space of the area. That would trip me out. It would trigger my anxiety.
Wow.
Whereas before that experience, it didn't.
All right. Do you think that you were worried about doing these spiritual practices and that triggering another experience?
That's one piece of it. Yeah. So one reason I pulled back from some of the experiences, the really strong practices, was I didn't want to trigger more Kundalini or whatever tradition you want to call it. I know Sheikh Fraser had his own language for it. And he said, "Oh yeah, it should have happened to you. You were focusing your meditation on death that day, so yeah, parts of you were going to die." And so he would go into that spiel, and so I think that language, I get it, but the Kundalini fit more for me, and just how I understood and how I felt in the experience. So I use the Kundalini language.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah, I did fear triggering more of those experiences and pulled back. To answer.
Right. So, yeah, after, I kind of came down from my experience, I felt very disconnected. But years later, when I started my spiritual journey, I started meditating again. And I was trying to astral travel for a while, and I started feeling the Kundalini energy again, and that did scare me because I was like, oh, is that going to put me back in that experience, am I going to be ungrounded? Am I going to not be able to function and do normal life? But nothing like that happened, and I got used to that the energy, and now it's just kind of a part of my daily life, and yeah. So I understand you to a certain extent, for sure.
Yeah. You get used to it. It's, for me, it tapered off, but
Right.
it's every now and then would kick up again if I was doing something in particular. But the meditation, all different altered state work would definitely kick it up, but I became more used to holding that energy, more used to, oh yeah, this isn't going to be bad. I don't have to worry about ending up where I was. And so I was able to hold it a bit better. I never returned to the levels of the big experience, and I'm okay with that.
Right. Yeah. So would you say now, like, was that experience good or bad or a mix or?
I think it was a mix.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was a mix. There's a lot of writing about us Western, and in my case, white people that dabble in Eastern traditions and get burnt. And I wasn't intentionally dabbling in an Eastern tradition, but it kind of feels like that type of experience.
Getting burnt because they don't have the context and maybe the safety or the understanding of what might happen.
Yeah, you're not growing up in an ashram or a temple or something doing meditations from the time you're 5 years old to hold the space and the context within your vessel, your human vessel, to have these types of energies burn through it, right? Which I think in some of the Eastern traditions, not just people from the East, but I'm talking about people that are in ashrams that are focused on doing this work. They have the context of what to expect, and they're learning the theoretical components and all that. And I didn't have that. So when it hit me, there's some Western white dude that's in their 20s having this experience that blows him out of the water, and was completely unprepared. But I was given the framework because of the school I was in,
right?
Which again, I was lucky for that. But yeah. Does that answer the question? I kind of lost track.
Yeah, no, that was great. I appreciate it. Do you feel like that happened to you for a reason, or do you think that like you kind of spurred on that experience, or was that God giving you that experience, or how do you think about that?
That's a great question. And I think tied into the question you just asked about it, was it beneficial or detrimental, good or bad? And that, I think that's hard to say, because sometimes things that feel bad are ultimately good because, for example, I processed a lot of that grief and stuff around my grandfather. Horrible to go through, just like if you're doing trauma work, but necessary.
Right.
So there were good components and hard components of it, like the PTSD trauma piece. And the height anxiety and stuff. Was it given to me? Did I pursue it myself? I'm a big proponent of both ands. That's hard to answer. I feel less sure about what I think God knows and does now than I ever used to. Was it grace being bestowed, like a grace experience? Was it something from another dimension, from God, coming down and touching me? Or was it because of my practices and emerging within me, top down or bottom up? Yes to both. I don't know. I don't know. I definitely didn't ask for it. It wasn't like I said, please give me this experience.
Right.
In fact, when I heard about the experiences, even from the first days of our school, we were prepped for, in grad school, hey, things might happen. And they would describe worst case scenarios. I thought, I don't want that one. Of all these different experiences we can have in grad school, there's the one I don't want. And it was a Kundalini experience. So possibly by saying I didn't want, that put me on a trajectory to actually have it. Thanks, whoever's up there. So it's hard to say. I mean, I was doing the practices. I was engaged. So there was definitely a
Mm-hmm.
piece of me that was doing and
Mm-hmm.
active and pursuing and opening and doing that. But I also know, having done this work for quite a while and worked with a lot of people who've had different spiritual experiences, sometimes people do that work for years and years and years and years, decades, and never have
Mm-hmm.
an experience.
Mm-hmm.
So why was it that I did and somebody else did? I don't know the answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Right.
see myself as more special than anyone else that's been doing these practices for a long time. That's definitely not the case.
Right.
It's just, it's almost like I was standing in the wrong spot when a truck came by and hit me, you know.
Right. Yeah, I think back to my own experience. The semester leading up to the experience, I was really trying to work on my mental and spiritual health and get close to God. And um, yeah, and there was a song I listened to a lot. It's called "Oceans" by Hillsong United, and it's kind of talking about when Jesus was on the water and walking on the water, and then he asked Peter to come out to walk on the water with him, and Peter had to keep his eyes on him, and when he took it off, he started sinking. The
Yeah.
words are something like "Take me deeper than," um, yeah, just trusting Jesus and take me deeper in my faith and growth and stuff like that. And obviously, it's scary. It's something very supernatural and different. And I mean, I wasn't necessarily looking for something supernatural. I was just looking for a deeper faith and to have faith in. And so I wasn't exactly looking for that experience, but I was looking for healing and growth, and it happened.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Somebody
that's
said,
great.
okay, here you go.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um.
Before you move on, one of the things about that is looking back at my own period in evangelical church and then getting into yoga. There's what's called bhakti yoga, which is
Mhm.
the heart-based love yoga, which the two feel so similar. It's that
Mhm.
when I was in evangelical church, that love and heart-based focus in the tradition when it was at its best. Um, felt very similar. So I don't know if there was some kind of bhakti yoga going on beforehand,
Mhm.
before even landing in the school and starting to do some of the other practices and kind of that opening of the heart chakra, heart center. I don't know.
Mhm. Right. You mentioned God and being less sure about what he does and all that. I
Mm-hmm.
guess the conceptual understanding of him. After your experience, did your beliefs change?
Yes. Yes. So before the experience, I thought I had a pretty good grasp of people would go to church or not, do religious experiences and, engage and do their prayers, do nighttime meditation or prayers. Meditation made you feel good, kind of relax the body and mind.
Mm-hmm.
But that was about it, and the rest was kind of up to what happened on the other side of the veil,
Mm.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say I probably was more deity oriented then than I am today.
DD
More
oriented.
deity, God,
Oh, gotcha. Mm-hmm.
a being. Um, and so the belief was that God had it in hand. God was in
Mm-hmm.
charge. After the experience, my holy heck, what was that? um, made me realize again, like going back to what I was saying, the impact that some of these practices can have on our physical world. It's like the
Mm.
veil wasn't there the same way. That barrier
Right.
between
Yeah.
worlds was torn asunder,
Mm-hmm.
and the energies flowed into this world, and something happened that was completely unexpected and
Mm.
scary in the experience, and
Right.
even the after effects very scary at times, most of the time, until I was grounded and healing from it. And so I garnered a bit of a fear of some of the experiences, or some of the practices, and less certainty about somebody being in charge in a way. But I was still God focused. I was still had the awareness and belief in God. My questioning that more has been more in the past 20 years, so much later in life. Just kind of more pantheistic. I was pantheistic as well, integrating kind of a pantheism into deism, but past 20 years I've been more pantheistic, I think, than.
Yeah. I definitely like during my experience, I was saying a lot like God is in everything, and feeling that connection, and again, like you said, the veil between the spiritual and the physical world was broken, and saw the universe in a different light. And I've talked to in different people in different ways a lot on this podcast, kind of about that view. And I do like panentheism, which is more God is above all things, but also within all things. But the more I talk about it and explore, I'm not sure I see such a difference between pantheism and panentheism. And I'm open, and so it is really interesting. I think that in my studies and seeing mystics and different people who have these experiences, I think they a lot of times have these kind of realizations. And it's just funny because you grew up already being connected to the spiritual world, and like you said, maybe having this pantheism view, but after the experience, I guess maybe it moved from more conceptual to a more experiential, like this is real, I know it. I experienced it.
That's a good way to put it. That it's not just something to think about, it flows through. It's interesting you say that you were, before your experience, focused kind of on the God is in everything.
Well, no, that was during my experience.
Okay.
Before, I think a lot of Christians, kind of what my friend Josh says is they're Christian dualists. So they're like, the spiritual world is here, physical world is here. God can come down and make changes when he wants, but besides that, they're separate. And so afterwards is more like God is in everything, is within us, and he does work, but he also does it through us, and we have a part to play too. And so maybe like what you're saying, like, is God so in control? I think that we have this free will to choose, and it's all interconnected. The top down and above.
So the reason it stood out for me is because I would say especially the year leading up to my experience, this particular experience, I was really focused on that feeling. It wasn't just conceptual, it was the feeling, and doing meditations on the divine being in everything, being in the tree stump, as well as the tree that was just cut down, as well as that tree there that's intact, as well as that person walking by, as well as the sidewalk, as well as just infusing the entire world, creating the sunsets, as the creator. Just being surrounded in that. And so that's the mental space I was in when I went into my experience, and the belief state, I should say, I was in, and I held that belief state, but it came with an oh shit. And I'm not saying I don't believe in God now. It's just I feel more removed, more. I'm focusing more on two things. More on the God is in everything around me piece.
Right.
But also I think that my clinical practice impacted me because I became so heady.
Right.
Since 2015, going through the clinical mental health, yes, there's the integration of spirituality into counseling, the counseling practice in particular, but I have felt a personal shift in my practices that I have felt more distant. Even though I'm doing meditations, even though, I don't do them as much, I don't do a lot of my practices as much as I used to. Building my practice and building up my clientele and all that. So I just personally, there's been a shift for me. I wouldn't say it's a dark night experience, but kind of in the Christian or Catholic tradition, dark night of the soul. I think I've gone through periods of that, but it feels adjacent to that in some way.
Right.
And I feel that there's going to be a shift in the future back towards, and I think I'm even maybe in that. I think this podcast and us connecting maybe a piece of that shift for
That's
me
great.
again. A piece, maybe going a little bit too much into history with transference. I was in academia for 20 years, but when the school ITP fell apart and got sold and all the faculty were fired, I was actually the last remaining faculty in the global distance program for a year after all the other faculty had been fired, let go. That was a very traumatic experience and made me think I didn't want anything to do with transpersonal stuff anymore for a long time. And so that pain, it became associated and I pushed away from from the practices, put it that way. And I went more heady.
Right. Yeah. I think, I'll say that after my experience, feeling very disconnected, I just kind of went away from religion and thinking about spirituality, all that stuff for a while. Because my experience kind of blew my beliefs out of the water and I didn't know what to make of my own experience. And then my spiritual journey, I think I started to regain an understanding or a new understanding of who God was and theology and all that stuff. I will be completely honest that. So I'll say this: there's a author named Paul Smith, and he kind of talks about Christianity and awakening and a new way of thinking about it. And a big part of Christianity is the Trinity. So the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and he calls it the three faces of God: God above, God beside us, and God within us. And so I think since my experience, I really have that sense of God within us. It's a lot stronger than it was before. And God within all things, but God above us, and kind of talking to God as if He's a person above me is, I would say, not as strong as it was before. And sometimes that bothers me. And sometimes is that better or worse? Or I don't know. Am I missing something? So I understand what you're saying. And there's been times in my spiritual journey where I was trying to figure things out and I got very heady. And so I'm trying now to find that balance between the practice and the relationship and the intellectual and the thinking about it and all that stuff. So I think they're both good in their context. Just trying to balance it all.
Yeah. That actually also matches something I learned from the Kundalini tradition, which is that you can awaken from any one of the chakras. It's like the original most often held belief is that energy goes from base chakra up through the Sushumna to the crown, and that's the awakening. But it's not considered the only awakening. There are some people who go through the heart chakra being blown open. That's the awakening that awakens the whole system. But you can also do that through second chakra, third chakra, fifth chakra, which I always found fascinating.
Yeah.
So thinking of those three different gods, in this tradition, you can become awakened in many different ways. It's not just the one.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And on my spiritual journey, the last few years, I felt like I've had experiences and worked through different chakras, and sometimes it's been painful, sometimes it's been euphoric, and I feel like I've had kind of more opening of these chakras. So it's a fun journey. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's painful, but I know ultimately it's a good thing, because it's working through pain and trauma, and working through healing to spur on growth.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to cover or say?
Wow. I think that having gone through my experience, it led me to that's the reason why I did my dissertation on near-death experiences, kind of down that trajectory. And we'll get more into that, I think, in the other time when we're talking about near-death experiences and my grandmother's experience and all that. But it also led me to assist and working with assist and presenting on really engaging with this idea of not just the integration process, but there's different types of experiences. Some people have one big experience in their life and nothing else. Right. Other people have multiple small experiences throughout their life. Some people have small experiences that lead to a big experience, and then it might have several others. That feels a little bit more like mine. Other people will have one big experience and then kind of taper off, and then another big experience, taper off. So there's lots of different ways for them to happen. But they all need integration. They don't all need professional help for integration. Some people have an experience. It's wonderful. They have growth and development, and they're fine. Great. I love that for you, whoever you are. That's, kudos. That's wonderful. But not everybody does. Some people have experiences where there's a lot of difficulty involved, whether it's internal for themselves, their own thoughts and emotions and spiritual practice and whatever, whether it's structural, external, family, they end up in, a psych ward or hospital. There are impacts to external social structures, school, work, and they have to deal with those impacts, so there might be integration around that. So the integration process can look very different depending on how traumatic it is, which version of, whether it's a bunch of small leading to a bunch of bigs, whatever, and differentiating mental health pieces with the spiritual piece is really important. And why I think things like, assist, and also there's different counseling organizations and in the APA organizations there as well that focus on spirituality and psychology, because having space to go through, is this a panic disorder, or is it panic disorder and something else? Or is it just something else? And it affects treatment and how you integrate and how you work and what type of team you put together. Do you have a therapist and a spiritual director? Do you have, somebody that's a psychiatrist on board helping you with meds? It impacts the type of team you put together.
Right.
And so,
and that's my own journey as well, and training under Elizabeth to become a spiritual coach and help people who've had these experiences. And of course, if they have mental health issues, and they need a therapist, and definitely will refer them. And they might just go see them. They might see us both in tandem, but yeah, I think it's really important work, and it's very dear to my heart.
Well, and there's something valuable about the coaches and also peer support that helps reduce the stigma, right? It's like, I'm not going to the therapist. I'm not going to a psychiatrist, but I will talk to, my friend over here. That's my peer support, or my coach, spiritual coach.
Right.
That can feel very different and is critical to helping overcome a lot of the stigma. And so I value the work that you guys are doing with that in that respect.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Same to you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah. I think, what you're saying, we had really big experiences, and like you said, you're like, I don't think I'm someone special, or someone may practice these spiritual practices for a long time and not have a big experience. I would say that, I'm not special that it happened to me. It's actually because I was so unhealthy that I needed an experience to get me over the hump to get healthier. And of course that took a long time too.
Yeah.
But ultimately it was a good thing. And so I think there are some people who, like you said, they just gradually grow and heal over time, and they don't need any big experiences. And maybe that's because they're more healthy than I was. So, I hope people don't get the, that sense of like, oh, they had a really big experience and, they're special, or they think they're more special than me. So we all have our own journey, our own way of going about it.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ryan. It's been really enjoyable. I really appreciate you and you sharing and opening them up, and your expertise and your experience with helping others in this.
Yeah, thank you, Kendall, for inviting me into this space and taking the time to hear about my story, and for all of you listeners for taking the time to listen to the story. I hope it's been valuable in some way, but thank you all. Your presence and your listening is a gift. I appreciate it.
Yes, and I look forward to our next conversations about near-death experiences.
Sounds good.